And scrubs away the grime and keeps the shine without scratching like powders.
You're right, and look at that shine.
Javix Scrub and Shine scrubs away the grime and keeps the shine without scratching like powders.
I love it, but I don't dare buy it. It's just too delicate to wash.
I've washed mine many, many times.
Really? It's beautiful.
I use Ivory Snow exclusively because it's a pure soap. And there's nothing safer to clean all my fine washables. I've tried others, but I believe in Ivory Snow.
I'll take it. And I'll take the blouse.
Pure soap Ivory Snow. Nothing safer for fine washables.
I had to write Ivory about my wife, Beverly, because her skin is really healthy looking.
You see, I'm a flight attendant, and when you're around people as much as I am, it's really important to look your best. Ivory really helps. I don't want a soap that leaves heavy perfume and deodorant on my face. I want Ivory Purity. Its gentle cleaning is important for healthy-looking skin.
Ivory Purity, a gentle way to healthy-looking skin.
Beverly does have healthy-looking skin. I like that.
If you know a healthy-looking Ivory girl, write us.
Cindy, where's the ASA?
In the bottle.
Oh, I've got the dress stand, but
Then you have the ASA, too.
what? Dress stand, it's all right here. Look, something for drips, something for congestion, and see this? That's ASA for your headache and fever, too. It's all there. You shouldn't take another
well,
thing.
that's it.
Gee, a lot going for you in dress stand.
Uh-huh. A lot.
Coming up next, Webster.
Good morning. It could only happen in Vancouver. It's rather depressing to get back into the nitty-gritty of the details of the actions of that almost incomprehensible Vancouver City Council and its incredible leader, the intrepid Mike Harcourt. Every day when I go downtown, I see right and wrong the stadium going up. All the huge pylons, $110 million worth, 60,000 seats. To get into that stadium, if Harcourt and company carry on the way they're doing now, you're going to have to go by helicopter, mule train, or on foot, or on your hands and knees. I know perfectly well that the arrogant social credit government in Victoria stepped into the field of Vancouver and said, like it or lump it, you're going to have $1 billion development. It's going to be free enterprise developed. We're going to give it to the big boys who can handle money, and we're going to give you a new town centre. And of course they were upset about it, but the facts of life must be faced. The stadium is there. People have accepted the stadium. Harcourt wants the stadium, but by his actions now, you would think he didn't. And the actions of this, we can't call them Weasley, this confused city council are almost beyond belief. Right as of this moment, the deadline has passed for the official planning and the start of the roads to meld with the opening of the $110 million stadium in mid-1983. What lies behind it all? Very few people on City Council look good at all. If there's a word of praise to be given, forgive me, George, it's to Puel, who was against the downtown stadium, but is perhaps the only one on council who is facing reality and practical matters. The trouble with Harcourt, of course, and the trouble with the Cope people on council, is that they don't want Bennett to get any credit for anything at all. And they will drag their feet, and they'll be as difficult as they can, as long as they can, but they'll all be at the opening of the stadium if and when the connecting roads ever go in. The best way to describe the actions, and don't forget too, that the BC Place people are not my favorite people, but they, with the city officials, had agreed on minimum plans, not for a freeway, Mike Harcourt, but for a connecting 4-lane highway. cities sitting biting its thumbs about the Cambie Street Bridge. Obviously, we're going to have a new Cambie Street Bridge. The damn thing won't fall down, but it's older than Methuselah. I can describe the actions of Vancouver City Council as comic opera. No lover of Bennett he, said Webster, when it comes to taking away the powers of Vancouver City Council. But Mike, baby, face reality. You'll never get Rankin, Erickson and whatnot to face reality, but you at least can face reality and let them get started on the minimal roads without any more wasted time. I don't hear a single trade union complaining about the millions of hours of work which lie ahead in a very dicey economy because of the arrogant action of the social credit government of Victoria. It's a fact of life. Get off your butt, Michael. Vote something clearly to let them get ahead with the stadium. Well, it's nice to be back, I suppose. I should be more moderate and more tolerant. But talking about social credit, Jim Nielsen, you know how forthright Jim is, has increased the home care budget in his health plan from $36 million to $52 million. I suspect that most of this money goes to salaries and administration. But he has done something else, all in the name of economy. Part of it may be right, but he has frozen the number of hours to home care clients at the same level as last year, 5.3 million hours. Here is a classic example of a woman who is sorely affected by the cuts. Her name is Emerald Bartlett, and Steve Wyatt will be telling you about her problem and her views later in the program.
Would you like to live in an institution? Would you like to be told when to go to bed? Would you like to be involved in some neatly arrived at little group of activities rather than getting up some morning and deciding you drive to Kelowna?
It's a tough problem. Now, a personal confession. The only gold I have is a small piece of gold in my teeth. But most of us are filled with cupidity and greed. Gold. Remember Harry Brown with his $1 million home in Vancouver? Well, there's a fella called Cavelti here this morning to tell you, no matter your financial state of affairs, how to invest in gold and make millions. Be a capitalist. And of course, my first guest on the program this morning is a bit of a capitalist. He just voted himself a salary increase. Svend Robinson, an NDP MP, full of good deeds and blanket condemnations of the Liberal government. But I'm glad Robinson's here this morning because we're going to have at Canada's Watergate, the McDonald Commission Report on the RCMP and government scandals. First after the break. One theory that many influential outsiders hold about Canada is that we are apathetic, especially in the field of authoritarianism by the government. I make specific reference to the McDonald Commission Report into the RCMP scandals. And I think the word scandals is correct, even though the RCMP were left leaderless by the politicians through the taut and tense years of the October Revolution and thereafter. I've read the McDonald Commission Report. It's very difficult to read. The report is extraordinarily badly organized. The NDP critic on justice is Svend Robinson, and we can expect him to go up the back of the Liberal government with a mallet. But overall, should Canadians be ashamed of the actions of the RCMP in the barn burnings, the dynamiting, the illegal surreptitious entry, 463 or something in British Columbia, the blanket signing of warrants by Solicitor Generals to continue phone taps with what seems to be illegal authorization? Should we be ashamed of it?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that this is perhaps one of the most shameful periods in the history of the country, Jack, in terms of the RCMP security service. It's important to emphasize that. There's a lot of confusion out there about the distinction between the RCMP, the fellows that we call if there's a break into the house, on the one hand, on the other hand, the men in the shadows, as they've been called by some, the security service. By Sawatsky, that's right. And I have no doubt that we should certainly be very seriously concerned about their actions over the past decade and more.
Well, I put the blame in a different place, really. The blame belongs where? For the overt and often illegal acts which were taken by the Mounties. Where does the blame really lie?
The blame rests squarely, if there's going to be blame assigned, the blame rests squarely on the people that should have been controlling the Mounties.
Who was that?
And that was the government. That was the Liberal government.
It was the politicians.
It was the politicians, and I must say it wasn't just the government. In fairness, it was the opposition as well that failed to ask the questions that should have been asked.
But what shines through the report all the way is that it seems to me that with the possible exception of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who looks good, who at least was firm and knew what he was doing, that the rest of the solicitors general seemed to mumble and stumble and be afraid to ask the Mounties any questions.
Well, I disagree with your assessment of Trudeau's role in this thing, Jack. There's an important section in the report which indicates, as you recall, that Trudeau was told, 1970, Starnes told him, look, we've been breaking the law for 20 years. And Starnes himself said that, and I agree that Starnes' testimony tends to vary depending on when you talk to him. But Starnes said that he warned the government. The McDonald Commission came to the conclusion that Trudeau was warned. What did he do about it? Absolutely nothing.
Now, just a minute. You're referring to something which followers of this kind of thing will want to read in detail. You're referring to the appallingly poor notes and minutes of meetings made by senior civil servants, Crim Acts, 20 years illegal. Those minutes were reconstructed after the policy planning meeting by a civil servant who didn't have a proper note of what happened. Is that not correct?
Well, that's correct, but there's no doubt whatsoever, if you read the testimony of Trudeau, which I've done before the McDonald Commission, and you probably have done that as well, there's no doubt that Trudeau acknowledges that there was some sort of warning. Now, he tries to shuffle it off as being...
But Trudeau says if there was some kind of warning, if somebody, looking back, I'm not going to contradict, he said, but if somebody had said to me straight up that there was illegal acts and 20 years of it, I'm sure some questions would have been asked. Is that not what he says?
He says that, but I don't accept that, and I don't think the Canadian people should accept that.
Well, let me go to the other side. Surely it's essential that in Canada today or yesterday or tomorrow, that when it comes to national security, certain acts must be taken for the good of the state, which may well breach the criminal code.
Absolutely not. Absolutely
Never,
not.
ever.
Never.
Ever.
The fact of the matter is that if we're going to talk about the rule of law in this country, meaning anything, Jack, that if there are acts that have to be taken to protect national security, however that's defined, then those acts have to be legal. If the law isn't adequate at the present time, then change the law. Come before Parliament and say, this is the power that we need, this is why we need the power, give it to us.
So therefore, dear members of Parliament and opposition, we must have the legislation which enables us to train our highly sensitive electronic beams on the Soviet embassy in Ottawa to pick up or to interpret their code messages to Moscow.
Well, if that activity is presently illegal, then an argument could be made before Parliament that it should be made legal, and that's the appropriate forum. But to say that the RCMP have got the right to break certain laws will ultimately lead to a police state in this country.
Well, I can't really disagree with you. What really disturbs me most, though, about the Liberal government's actions was we get the McDonald Commission's report with a bunch of blank pages.
Yes.
You know, Operation
Sure.
Ham, Operation
Yeah.
Bricole, Operation this, that, and the next thing. We get the McDonald report, and then 5 minutes later, as if by prearrangement, a retired judge of the Supreme Court comes out with a decision totally negating or contradicting the McDonald Commission recommendation and saying, oh, everything the Mounties did was legal, more or less.
Well, this is, I think...
Wishart Spence was the judge.
Sure, Wishart Spence was a judge, and a very distinguished judge he was when he was on the Supreme Court.
And he may be right.
Judge.
He may be
but
right.
whether he's right or not is not the point. The fact of the matter is that this is a really shoddy example of how this government, even before the report was released, made up their mind that they were going to wash their hands of any responsibility. As soon as they received the report, they hired Spence, they hired a couple of others as well, said, we want to know exactly what the legality of this is, and when the report is released, we'll tell you what's legal. We don't care what the McDonald Commission says. We'll tell you what the case really is.
Yeah, that is disturbing.
And that is very disturbing.
What was the other thing after the release of the report which probably upset you? Mind you, didn't you break the law once yourself?
Not to my recollection, Jack. Nothing that...
Do you not remember the time
No, I
you went
don't
through
remember.
that phony business of hiding the Cuban deport or some deportee from Spain?
From Spain, I
You looked very bad in that. Looked like a lawbreaker to me.
I have never broken the law.
Remember the
Jack.
case?
I remember the case of Galindo Madrid.
That's the one I'm talking about.
We've discussed that one before, and I challenge you right now, Jack, right now, sitting here, to tell me one law which I broke.
You set a very bad example.
Well, no, but you're talking about breaking the law. What law did I break?
You broke a Webster law. You set a bad example. By the way, before we get back to this, what was the raise you got?
What was which?
The increase you voted yourself as a member of the House of Commons.
I thought we were talking about the McDonald Commission.
It's just to rattle you. What was the increase you voted yourself?
Well, I'm going to have to take that in reference to your salary. Now, tell me again what your salary is, Jack.
My salary is the subject of negotiation. I can't vote myself an increase. It's none of your business. Your money is public money. It's my money. It's totally my business.
Well, I think that your money is also a matter of interest to the public.
Interest?
If you're attacking me for being overpaid, which I trust you're not.
I did not. I asked you how much of an increase you had voted to yourself in the House of Commons.
It was an average increase over the last 6 years.
Don't give me the average increase. What was it last year? What will it be this year?
Between 1974 and 1981, the increase was 35%.
Witness, please answer the question.
Between 1974 and 1981, the increase was 35%, Jack.
What was the increase in dollars?
The increase in dollars would have worked out to probably about, it was about $14,000.
Are you suggesting to me, Mr. Robinson, that you don't know what your increase was specifically?
The increase went from $33,600 a year to $44,500 a year in the salary, and it went from about $12,500 in the tax-free expense allowance to about $14,400.
Not unreasonable.
In the tax-free expense allowance.
Why didn't you tell me that first time around? We could have avoided this nagging back and forward.
No, well, that's why I guess I'm a little sensitive on
Yes, you are. I'm sure you should be.
Naturally, because of the timing of it was unfortunate.
Because you can pay a mortgage.
But I frankly think that in the terms of the job that I do, I earn every penny of it, Jack.
I must say, it made quite an impression, especially on the Constitution. But you're a big boy. You're entitled to be hammered on these embarrassing things.
Absolutely.
We'll get back to the McDonald Commission report. I apologize for that diversion after the break. I try to be a practical, common-sense person, quite seriously. Svend Robinson, NDP. Constituency again, quick.
Burnaby, Jack.
Burnaby. And I don't agree with you all the way. I think there is a way, under a democratic system, in emergency times or emergency situations, for authority to be given to do acts which are outside the law for the good of the state, properly checked and approved by, say, a committee of the leaders of the House of Commons meeting with the Prime Minister.
No, I mean, I agreed with you up until you said outside the law. Then you get into Joe Clark's formulation. That was his proposal, that the police should be able to break the law and then afterwards come to some sort of committee of the House of Commons. If the police need powers in emergency times, which a good argument can be made that they do, no question of that.
The War Measures Act is there. Who wants to use it?
Then, no, not the War Measures Act. That should have been taken off the books a long time ago. Establish new legislation.
Trouble with that is if you establish new legislation, you give a Prime Minister down the road or now a blanket authority to do things which shouldn't be covered by that law.
No, but that's why the law has to be carefully written. You're going to give him the blanket authority, you're going to give the police the blanket authority to break the law, and then come to the Prime Minister afterwards.
You know, I'm not that keen on this separate security service, which has, without debate of the support, been announced by, who's the Solicitor
By
General?
Kaplan, yeah, by Bob Kaplan.
Tell me what's happening on that and what you think of it.
Well, really, what that comes down to is basically contempt of Parliament, and I'd use those words advisedly, Jack, because the Commission made certain recommendations. They suggested there should be a civilian security service, a lot of agreement with that. But instead of saying, all right, we're prepared to look seriously at that recommendation, what the government has said is, here's our man, he's the man who's going to make the changes, and not only is he the man that's going to make the transition, he's the guy that's going to head the civilian security service.
Fred Gibson?
Now, Fred Gibson, yeah. He's a career civil servant, has absolutely no involvement whatsoever with security, says that he finds Amnesty International to be too radical for him, and it says that he intends to rely upon the RCMP for assistance in this transition period. Well, frankly, those things don't sit comfortably.
Let me spell out. Here we have the McDonald Commission, which makes certain recommendations, a little bit difficult to follow, a little bit fuzzy, but basically speaking, they say even for the police to follow a car at high speed, it's a breach of the law. That's silly.
Well, it may be silly, and perhaps that law should be changed, but in the
Anyway,
meantime,
they make certain recommendations about a separate security service outside the Mounties. And has this been debated by the House of Commons yet?
Hasn't been debated in the slightest. Not only that, the government has already rejected the suggestion that there should be some form of accountability to Parliament. I have asked, as a member of the Justice Committee, basic questions. For example, how much money do we spend every year on the security service?
Do we know?
No.
Is it hidden in the Mountie budget?
We're not told. We have no way of knowing. And the McDonald Commission quite properly says there's got to be some form of parliamentary accountability.
Do the Americans know what they spend?
Certainly they do. They've got two committees of Congress. They've got a Senate committee and a congressional committee which is informed of any operations ahead of time, any major operations, and there's some sense of accountability there. This government has already said, we reject that. We reject that completely.
I want to refer you to the third report, in which the Commission discusses the fact that Mr. Trudeau appeared in camera, but would not, and made it quite clear that he would not come into a public forum. And then MacDonald, in rather a humorous bit, sets out the reasons why the Prime Minister is compellable as a witness, but can't be brought before the committee. And roughly speaking, this all boils down to the fact that if they did compel Trudeau had compelled him against his wishes to be a compellable witness in public, they didn't know who to send to pick him up if he refused to come.
That's right, that's right.
What do you plan to do about that?
Well, certainly, if you read again the testimony of Trudeau, there were a number of questions which the McDonald Commission wanted to put to him in public session, but never got to. And they make that quite clear. There were 5 key questions that they never got to put to him.
Which he answered in camera and which are published in the report.
Which he has not answered in camera. There are 5 questions.
He sent by letter.
Well, he sent by letter, but that he can't be cross-examined on a letter.
Right.
I think, Jack, that what should happen, and what I intend to do when Parliament resumes its session, is to haul Trudeau before the House of Commons Justice Committee. We have the power as members of Parliament to ask Trudeau to come before our committee, the Justice Committee, and answer a few questions and be prepared to be cross-examined by members of Parliament, not just sending along a letter with his version of what happened, but answering some pretty tough questions.
You've got to admire him when he was on some television thing in the East when somebody said, did you or didn't you? Oh, would the Soviet embassy be a target? And he said, if you asked me that question, I would probably say, I don't know. When everybody knows that the Soviet embassy is a target, as would be the Cuban embassy.
Of course it's a target.
As was a French diplomat, apparently, at one time. Maybe they panicked a little bit on the FLQ.
Well, Trudeau is the guy that ultimately has to take responsibility as the Prime Minister for the actions of the RCMP.
One thing I forget from the report, which you can refresh my memory on, what happened between which cabinet ministers and the Mounties on the list of people arrested at the time of the war measures? Well,
you remember what happened there was that the RCMP came with a list to the government. I think there were over 300 of them, and apparently, according to Trudeau, he and Marchand and Gérard Pelletier, the 3 wise men, as they're called, went through the list and said, no, this person is just a loudmouth, this person isn't someone that should be arrested. Rather a disturbing, direct interference in what was the most massive peacetime arrest in Canadian history.
The other disturbing facet I'll ask you about, and we'll take calls, because you and I are probably in the wilderness with the public, despite our varying attitudes on the McDonald Commission Report. I'm inclined to think that the McDonald Commission Report into certain RCMP activities and the question of government knowledge is now dead and buried in the minds of the public.
Well, I'm not sure it's dead and buried in the minds of the public. Unfortunately, you talked at the beginning of the show about the fact that we tend to be rather submissive.
Authoritarian in our allowing our politicians to be authoritarian.
That's right, and I'm afraid that unfortunately you may be right that there isn't the kind of public attention that there should be on this report.
Calls to you're not McDonald, you're Robinson. On the McDonald Commission Report, give him a bad time. He's so holier than thou that his halo kills him. After the break. One thing which really disturbed me in the report, I think it was Allmand, who was the Solicitor General, and I think it was Starnes, correct me, who brought in the wiretap warrants in bundles. What was that?
Well, In fact, it was even worse than that. It was a bulk form. He just signed a form saying essentially that it's under the Official Secrets Act. The Solicitor General is supposed to examine each application for a warrant. These ones don't go to the judge. They go directly to the Solicitor General. And he just signed a form saying, yes, these are all fine.
I certify that these are all okay.
Sure.
Was it Stearns?
It was Stearns that brought them in, that's right.
And Allman would just say, okay, these are all valid under the Official Secrets Act, and sign everyone.
And he'd make Stearns swear an oath, and Michael Dare swear an oath.
Where did that list come from? Did that list of the so-called subversives at the time, or the subversives, or the dangerous people, did that come from Barassa, come from the RCMP?
That would, I suspect, have come from the RCMP, from their sources, whatever their sources may have been.
Another very disturbing thing at the time of the FLQ, there's a great piece in the report, it's probably been in the papers, about the Mounties losing faith in the Quebec Provincial Police, because when Rose was in his hideout and they were tapping the phone, within 20 minutes, Rose got a telephone call telling him his phone was bugged, and it came from the Quebec Provincial Police Force headquarters.
That's right, that's right. There was someone inside the force that was...
inside a force?
Yes.
They never were able to trace the call back to an individual?
No.
That's enough to make the Mounties paranoid, and you couldn't blame them, could you?
Don't blame them at all.
You couldn't trust anybody in that situation.
But Jack, there's one other thing that I think that should be, one other point I'd like to make about the report, and we've concentrated on the government, but I think the report and the commission failed in their responsibilities, because what they have essentially said is that this was illegal, and this was illegal, and this was illegal, and their response is, well, we'll just make everything legal. We'll make everything legal without, in my view, seriously looking at the grounds. For example, mail opening. I haven't yet seen a justification, a valid justification, for allowing the RCMP to open first-class mail. Kaplan was supposed to bring something before Parliament. He was embarrassed by what the RCMP gave him, and he's been silent on the question ever since.
You presumably could do it even now under a warrant under the Official Secrets Act.
You can't open mail under the Official Secrets Act because the Post Office Act bars that.
The Post Office can open mail.
Post Office cannot open mail. The Post Office Act cannot open under the Post Office Act.
The only legal thing they were doing there the only legal thing they did in Operation Cathedral, A, B, and C, was to photograph the outside of the envelope.
That's as long as they didn't delay the mail. If they were delaying the mail, then it was illegal.
Mind you, standing at the corner of the street in Vancouver, and if somebody's sending in a quarter ounce of heroin in envelopes, it's an awful temptation to nail them.
Absolutely. If they're sending in heroin in envelopes, what they can do is nab them when it arrives. But to open up first-class mail on a systematic basis, Jack, I don't think there's any justification.
I've kind of changed my view on that. I get hysterical about drugs at the time. Now I've given up on drugs. Who cares?
Well, no, I mean, I can understand that concern, but there's other ways of dealing with it than opening people's mail.
What about phone calls?
We have a law now which permits...
phone calls here.
Oh, well, let's take some, yeah.
I thought you were bright. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I had a question for Mr. Robinson. He just said that he had never committed any criminal act.
Don't make accusations against him.
I find that incredible, and I think the gentleman's setting himself up for a giant fall.
I haven't committed any criminal act either. Except a little bit of speeding, maybe. Never been caught.
Maybe I should clarify. Jack and I were talking about his favorite subject of Galindo Madrid.
Galindo Madrid.
And I had made it very clear that in connection with Mr. Madrid, I committed no criminal offense whatsoever.
Okay, what's your valid point, Colin? I thought you sounded intelligent.
My recollection was you asked him 3 or 4 times if he had ever committed any criminal act.
I was talking about Madrid and him giving, what's the word, sanctuary in his house, which I thought was appalling.
I see, but the Member of Parliament isn't saying that he has never committed any criminal act.
We all have committed criminal acts. Thank you. See how you can get fooled by a tone of voice? You told me where it was from. Victoria.
Yes, hello. I would just like to tell the minister that...
Not a minister. He's merely a lowly backbencher with a big mouth.
Oh, well, I would just like to more or less tell him that what he makes a year, it takes me about 3 years to make. And he's about one of the only people I know that can afford to live right now and buy a house. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if he voted NDP the last time.
I don't know whether he did or not, but the point he's making is a valid point, Jack.
Long Butte, near 100 Mile House. Go ahead, please. Lone Butte.
Lone Butte, that's right. Yes, Mr. Robinson, I'm just wondering, I've heard you talking, and I hope I understand correctly that you're a member of the Justice Committee. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Tell me, we're talking about RCMP and illegal acts. What recourse has a normal citizen got if he's been,
harassed?
Yeah, right, by RCMP, you know. Because 3 months ago I tried to get an internal investigation going, and I've heard nothing about that.
Hold on, please. I believe there is a new and fresh procedure.
Well, there's a proposal that the government has tabled, a new RCMP Act, which is very, very weak. It still gives the final say to the RCMP, but for the gentleman, very briefly, there is a procedure under the Police Act. You make an application, you're probably familiar with it, you make an
Under
application.
the BC Police Act, you make an application and they're bound to investigate it and carry it on to further steps.
I've done that, but...
And you have appealed. Sir, I'm not going to go into that this morning. Call me off the air sometime. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
That's you.
Mr. Robinson?
Hello?
Would you help me tell Mr. Webster that we pay his salary just as well as we pay your salary because we're paying the things that his company makes the money on to pay him. And every cent of his salary is just as public as yours. Would you try and tell him that?
Well, you've just told him that yourself, sir, very effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to do it, Robinson. I'm going to weasel on that. Go ahead, please. Maybe I should say do a Harcourt.
Hello?
Go ahead, please.
Yes, to me, the whole thing is a whitewash. They've just tried to destroy the RCMP. As far as the force is concerned...
It can't be both, ma'am. If it's a whitewash, it's... Well, carry on. I'm sorry I interrupted. It's a whitewash
The
that...
only recourse that we, the public, have is to go to the Supreme Court now. That's going to cost millions of dollars. And what chance have we? Thank you.
I thought she was on a good theme, but it kind of faded away. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
You suggested, Mr. Webster, that Mr. Robinson is holier than thou.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I wish I had an MP as qualified and hardworking as this very young man. And regarding the mail opening, I find that a really frightening proposition that our government would sanction that kind of activity. And will Mr. Robinson be asking questions about that in the House when it reconvenes?
Yes, ma'am, I certainly will. I have, in fact, raised this issue in Parliament already on a number of occasions, and when Parliament reconvenes, I will be doing everything I can to prevent the government from proceeding to violate our privacy.
What are your chances of getting the Prime Minister in front of the Justice Committee? No?
Well, it depends on the Liberal members of the Justice Committee.
But the practical answer, please.
The chances are pretty remote.
Pretty remote. Another segment of calls, if you wish to, with Svend Robinson on the McDonald Commission Report. I don't think we can spend too much time on it, really, to be quite honest, now and in the future. After the break. Question to Svend Robinson, NDP, Burnaby. Was there one Solicitor General, forget Mr. Trudeau for the moment, who at any time asked the right questions of the RCMP?
There wasn't any, Jack. They let them do their own thing. They gave them a mandate in '75, which was so broad as to allow them to carry on exactly the way they were carrying on before '75.
You know, you get the feeling that they must be briefed when they come into that job. Now, remember, Mr. X, Solicitor General, don't ask too many questions of the Mounties or you'll get to know too much.
Well,
would there have been anything wrong with a Solicitor General saying, look, I want to know what you're doing and when you're doing it so that I can veto it if I wish to?
Not only would there have been nothing wrong with that, that should have been the job of the Solicitor General.
Of all the Solicitor Generals involved in this long period, who comes out looking the best of a bad lot?
I think Warren Allman does. Warren genuinely tried to get some control over it. He didn't ask the right questions, but he comes out looking the best. I think Goyer comes out by far the worst.
There's one mounted police officer who comes out very forthright, for whom I developed a great admiration reading the report, and his name was...
It was Venner.
Venner.
Yeah.
He was the guy who came to Ottawa and said he was very upset by all these things, and he asked the people below him to tell him precisely.
He wanted to know what was going on, that's right.
Did he not pass that information up above?
I suspect he probably did.
Didn't get much
But that's
action.
where it died.
I mean, that's the dreadful thing. One doesn't mind being taken for a knave, but one shouldn't be taken for a fool. And if they don't ask questions, they're bound to be embarrassed in due course.
And the fundamental problem with all of this is that because of the nature of the security service, if the Solicitor General of the country isn't asking questions, no one else can, because in Parliament we can't ask questions about that.
Go ahead from Victoria.
Yes, Mr. Robinson.
Yes.
Mr. Robinson, I've been very impressed reading answered about your performance. I'm not a member of your party or anything to do with it, but I think your questions you've been posing regarding the RCMP are absolutely preposterous. Because when we consider that the major countries of the world, they all have undercover people. They're doing things that are illegal. They all do it, and they all understand they do it. We have had men, RCMP in other countries, undercover, and their health has failed, and they've almost given their lives for their country. Now, don't forget this, because I offered my life for my country. You're too young yet to make these decisions that are over and above and beyond your ability.
Well, sir, with great respect, I don't think that age is necessarily the criterion. I may be wrong, but don't fault me for my age.
You don't expect to be thinking the same, man. I'm over 70. You don't expect to think about the experiences I've had. And I've had a lot to do with the RCMP. I'm not a member.
No, I respect your experiences, sir. My concern is this, that because there is wrongdoing in another country doesn't in any way mean that we in Canada should be accepting that kind of wrongdoing here.
Surely the practical application is the way the British, before they were totally infiltrated by all their Cambridge graduates, used to do it themselves with the little export-import companies which were entirely on their own hook and had no findable connection with the establishment. John Stevenson, for instance, Intrepid.
Yeah.
He wasn't a British policeman, he wasn't an MI5 person, he was on his own.
And they had absolutely, and they still have no law enforcement powers whatsoever.
That's the difference. It's giving it to it's like lawyers going sour. Or they're the people with special powers who must be watched especially. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster, Mr. Robinson.
Morning.
I would like to know if there's a different section or where I could find something about customs laws, opening mail, and first-class mail as well.
Customs, yes. Customs do have a right, if they open them under the Customs Act, as I recall from the report, if they suspect, or can they only open parcels?
No, they, in fact, they can open anything that is not classed as first-class mail. Certainly, as the report indicates, they have been doing that regularly, along with some first-class mail. But if the gentleman wants, if you'd like specific details on the sections and so on, if you contact my office, I'd be quite happy to get you the detailed information on that.
Excuse me, Fred.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gladys, where do I go? Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mr. Robinson a question.
Right. Go ahead.
Yes,
Ma'am, put down your television set, please. It's impossible to ask a question when you're listening to the sound through your ears. Go ahead, please.
I would just like to mention that I think the public are getting the wrong idea about this mail opening thing. The police won't go in and just open anybody's private mail. They must have good reason to do it. I mean, we're dealing with terrorists as far as this RCMP business goes. They weren't going in and opening everybody's, letters from Aunt Sue and everything. I think they're getting the wrong impression of all of that.
Hold a second, ma'am. I think there was one case referred to where mail opening was used on the Japanese...
Yeah, the Red Terrorist.
The Red Terrorist.
The Red Japanese Red Army. However, as it turned out later, the mail opening, in fact, had nothing to do with the ultimate apprehension of that particular person.
You don't object? Do you object to the mail opening at a time of international terrorism if it's done with authority?
I think if there's valid authority and if it can be shown that in some way there's something inside the letter that is contributing to terrorism, that's a separate question. But to allow fishing expeditions and the reading of our mail sets a very, very dangerous precedent.
Go ahead, please.
I'd like to ask a question of, that's a strange question maybe. Recently, the RCMP were used to find 34 beauty queens, ex-beauty queens from the P&E at taxpayers' money. How did they justify that?
I didn't know
Especially in the face of this recent tragedy when we were trying to find the bodies of these missing and murdered girls.
I wasn't aware of that, but in any case, it could probably be done in a 2-minute phone call or looking up the city directory. It would... P&E could have done it itself. It's not a terribly difficult...
They claimed, and they made it public, that the RCMP found these people that they couldn't find for them. Right in the...
All they had to do was go on the air, and any one of us in the business could have found them.
Yeah.
Why the RCMP... And
we don't know enough about it to damn them. I'm sorry, it's a bit trivial. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. I think that that Sven is doing a damn good job there. He lets everybody know what's happening, and as far as the mail is concerned, I think it should be checked. There's too much terrorist activity around.
See that? Now, he's a supporter of yours, but he still wants to see mail checked.
Well, that's fair enough. As I say, I happen to think that I haven't seen the evidence yet. If the government can bring forward the evidence that they need the powers, fair enough.
Yeah,
sir.
I'm going to do one more segment with Svend Robinson, MP, after the break. Parliament goes back
October 14th.
October 15th. The NDP, a little bit tattered.
No, we've been invigorated after a summer holiday, Jack, and we're ready for action.
And have Broadbent and what's his name, Blakeney, kissed and made up?
And that happened at the last convention.
Well, they kissed and made up.
Everything is
and Bob
as
Ray
it should be.
Kissed and left.
Well, he hasn't left yet.
He's going to.
He's going to seek the leadership of the Ontario Party.
You'll go for the leadership one day. Don't have to answer that question. I know you will. Just blush modestly. Are you bilingual yet?
Yes, Jack, I am.
Totally?
I can work in the language.
Go ahead, please, from Summerland, in English. Or French. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
I am an ex-Mountie, you know, and I'm not a saint like Svend, who's never committed a crime. I committed one just about every day of my service, and at the salary of $116.25 a month. This is dated October 31st, 1943. And my income tax deductions were $45.80.
I'm bleeding for you, but what's your point?
Well, the point is this, that we should be thankful that we have the RCMP. During the war, when the Russians said it was an imperialist war and they were impeding recruiting, we intercepted their instructions to the Communist Party in Canada. And the only way we could intercept was by opening their mail.
The Russians were our allies.
If I had waited to get court order to do it, I would have never got that mail. And the superintendent of the Postal Service used to call me, and I would dash over there, get the letter.
Look, I believe your experience, I think, is correct, and I think Sven has a point he wants to make in wartime. Wartime is a different kettle of fish.
Well, wartime is a different kettle of fish, and one other point I'd like to make very quickly. I'm very familiar, sir, with the conditions, the working conditions and the pay level of RCMP officers. In fact, I spoke to a rally of about 1,000 RCMP officers right in Burnaby about 3-4 months ago who are trying to do something about working conditions, the Association of 17 Divisions. So I've done everything I can to improve working conditions within the force.
That was one of the pieces of bureaucratic stupidity when they wouldn't let that putative trade union,
Anyway, we know what
trade union use the letters RCMP in their title.
Certainly, yes.
Remember that.
Yeah.
But let's be fair to the Mounties. I think that if Gibson sets up his security service, there'll be a bunch of amateurs in there for many years, and it won't be as good or as effective as the RCMP was in its own way.
I think that there's a danger that certainly that we haven't got the people with experience, and if they don't use the experience of people who are in there now, within a legal context, there could be problems.
From Sydney, go ahead, please.
Yes, hello. Mr. Robinson, I have two quick questions for you. One, do you think the Commission went deep enough in their investigations as far as discovering illegal acts committed? And two, do you believe those members of the force charged will ever really be brought to justice?
Well, my answer to both questions is no. I don't believe the Commission went nearly deep enough. They didn't give the right to cross-examine by representatives of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. I don't think they went nearly deep enough. With respect to the second question, I doubt very much whether there will be any kind of effective disciplinary action against members of the force who should be disciplined, who clearly broke the law. And in some provinces, not in the province of Quebec, but in some provinces, there will be no criminal charges whatsoever against those people who clearly appear to have broken the criminal law.
There are 18 or 19 charges laid in Quebec right now.
That's correct.
There have been a couple of 3 or 4 officers charged, including Cobb, who were dealt with in court.
Well, he got an absolute discharge, yes.
So in other words, perhaps we're looking at a double standard where it comes to citizens and members of the RCMP?
Well, that's precisely the point. If
there is a different color to the act, though. If a man, the bad thing about the RCMP was that lower-level officers were left on their own hook with people above them using the Nelson touch. Do it, but don't tell me. Right?
Well, that's fair enough. But
and is it fair to a guy who was sincerely trying to do what he thought was his bidden duty, to nail him because of the lack of clear direction from those above.
Well,
It's not fair.
The people that should be nailed are those people within the force.
There's no evidence against them. If they did the Nelson touch, how can you nail them in court?
No, but there's evidence in the McDonald Commission Report of people who willfully disobeyed the law, and if rule of law is to mean anything in this country, those people have to be dealt with.
I agree with you, but you can't help feeling a certain bond of sympathy with McCleary and Brunel, was it?
Brunette, I believe it was.
Brunel and Brunette.
Yeah.
They were two good guys doing what they thought was the wish of those above. It's like working for a British chain newspaper, where nobody has to tell you how to slant it, but you do the unspoken wish of the Lord in London.
Well, if we start allowing people to break the law because they have the best of intentions, we're on a very slippery slope.
I'm not saying that. I'm merely saying it's hard to be hard on them.
Fair enough.
Especially when Solicitor Generals sat there like dummies, not asking questions.
Absolutely.
Dummies? Yeah.
Dummies, sure.
Good word. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm a former member of the Security Service. I've been listening to your comment, and I read the report, McDonald Report, and I wonder if Mr. Robinson could address himself to the point of how it's really going to be much different for a civilian service to operate.
Well, I think the major difference will be in, at least according to the rationale of the government, the major difference will be in the fact that they will have a clearly defined mandate to deal with, hopefully, certain specific areas. Right now there is no mandate whatsoever. And secondly, and this is the major reason that's given, and I want to hear the arguments on it, and I'd be interested to hear from you on it. The second reason is that you can attract a different type of person. You don't have to recruit through the forces of the RCMP directly, through the training, in Regina, and basically that you can get people who have special skills in the areas that are required for a security service.
Tell me, thank you, sir. Was it true, the Sawatsky story, have you any confirmation of it, that they started building a tunnel to the Chinese embassy, spent a lot of money, the Chinese embassy changed its plans, and they had to blow up the tunnel?
I suspect that's probably true. I've got no confirmation on it, but the government has been awfully quiet on that particular allegation.
Isn't it wonderful?
Well, it's a waste of millions of dollars.
My thanks to Svend Robinson, NDP MP for Burnaby. We won't bet. You won't get Trudeau in front of the Justice Committee.
We'll do what we can.
My thanks. Next, sad story of Emerald Bartlett after the break. I'm not entirely antipathetic to what Jim Nielsen, the Minister of Health, is doing. He insists the cutbacks are not really cutbacks, and that he's actually increased the homemaker care budget from 36 million to 52 million. Yes, the overall health budget's about $1 billion, but most of the increase, one suspects, goes to salaries and administration. I've had many calls and many complaints about the Homemaker Service. What has been done has been a big assistance to many people in real trouble. But the trouble with the Homemaker Service to clients this year is it is at the same level as last year, 5.3 million hours. It seems an awful lot. But the demand for the service at the same time has increased by 25%. And everyone's being assessed individually. Now, the Emerald Bartlett case is a very special case, and I sent Steve Wyatt, my reporter, out to do a stand-up and interview Emerald Bartlett.
Jack, that's the home of Emerald Bartlett. She's 68 years old and a quadriplegic. She has been restricted to a wheelchair now for 11 years. Up until 1978, she paid $7,000 a year to have someone come in and do those day-to-day things for her that most of us don't give a second thought. Then 3 years ago, the provincial government took over the funding for the Community Homemakers Service. And now the provincial government, under the Ministry of Health, has ordered some severe cutbacks. Mrs. Bartlett, for example, will lose 50 hours of help every month. The president of the Community Homemakers Association in this province says the government is playing cruel games with the poor and the helpless here. Mrs. Bartlett, on the other hand, is more to the point. She says it's a struggle just to survive.
Foundation.
Could I have local 74?
I'm sorry, I had a problem with my switchboard. I can't transfer any calls at the moment. No one's in there anyway.
No one's in. Okay, thank you. Bye.
The simplest thing may seem to be a monumental chore, but Emerald Bartlett is a very independent woman. She has been a nurse, a psychiatric social worker, and a vocal champion for the disabled. But now that she has lost 50 of her 200 hours every month, all that is over.
I need help to do almost all the activities of daily living. I can survive in terms of breathing in and breathing out. And I suspect that is the case with a lot of the people who are alleged to be in my situation, surviving on less hours. I think what they're doing is surviving. What I was doing was living, was certainly with restrictions, but I was living.
What will you have to do now?
I will have to stay in bed 1 day out of every 2.
Spend the whole day in bed?
The whole day.
By yourself?
By myself, with the exception of making the exception that I will need people to come in during 3 hours of the day, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the middle of a 12-hour period, and 1 hour at the end of, at say 10 o'clock at night, to give me a drink, to tidy up my bed, to turn me over, to do any urgent things.
There may be an argument that, you know, you live in a nice house, why not sell it and put yourself in some kind of institutional care? Is that not a solution?
You know, I don't know what you know about institutions, but that is really the end of the road. In institutions, people's autonomy has vanished. You know, do I look as though I could live in an institution? I may look as though it, but do I sound as though I could live in an institution? Now, all I have to say is, would you like to live in an institution? Would you like to be told when to go to bed? Would you like, if you needed help for it, to have to wait until somebody arrived to go to the bathroom and find it was too late, which frequently happens to those people? Would you like to be involved in some neatly arrived at little group of activities rather than getting up some morning and deciding you drive to Kelowna?
So this cutback then is also threatening your autonomy?
Oh, yes, it does. Well, I think you could say it leaves me with the choice to live in a very subsistence manner. I will certainly give up all my community activities, and not in a petulant fashion. It's because I simply don't have enough working time to do anything but look after my present affairs.
The largest homemaker agency in Canada operates out of that building here in Vancouver. Originally, they were faced with a 30% reduction in the total number of hours given to their 2,400 clients every month. So far, they have managed an 11% cutback, even though the demand from new clients has jumped by 25% this year. And already they have exceeded their budget over the same time last year. The director here, Diana Cox, is not alone. There are hundreds of agencies all over the province who are juggling hours against demand and available money in order to maintain the same level of care.
We can't provide the same level of service. What is happening at this point is that those whose need is fairly basic, they're the ones at this point who are being affected most by the cuts. And it means, for instance, instead of a homemaker providing 4 hours of service 1 morning a week, she's now providing 4 hours 1 morning alternate weeks.
So you can't do the same work in half the time?
You can't really. The homemaker is trying, and I think this is putting stress on the homemaker because she's trying to do 8 hours work in 4 virtually.
There must be equal hardships on your side of this as well as for the disabled people.
Oh, I would say, I don't know if you'd call it a hardship. I certainly think it's a real stress for the homemakers because they are the ones who face the clients who have had their hours cut, who can be, many of them, can be very angry or despondent or worried, and they could take that out, in effect, take it out on the homemaker, whether they really mean to or not. And they can also expect the same level of care. We are
just
trying.
Can't expect it anymore.
Not really. We're trying to cut out, or the idea is that you would cut out certain tasks. Maybe we were shopping for them and now we can't do it. And therefore they're saying, yes, you do need your shopping done, but a friend, the family, or relative, or volunteer will have to do it.
So your employees are taking the flack, so to speak.
Yeah,
in a
really,
lot of this.
they are, yeah.
And it's, you know,
And also their work, the homemakers' work is being reduced substantially, and in order to try to maintain the same level of income, they will have to look after, instead of maybe 1 or 2 clients a day, 3 or 4, and that's an added stress going from one to the other.
you know, there is some argument from the Ministry of Health that, well, these people, we have to cut back, so these people are going to have to depend on family and friends to pick up the slack, so to speak. Do you think that's legitimate? Do you think that's possible?
I don't think it's realistic, not in this area. They just aren't there. Volunteers are in very short supply, and a volunteer isn't going to go in, really, they aren't that thrilled to go in and do those sorts of things, nor can you get them going in 7 days a week where people need this. And family and people are separated from their families, or they just are, they don't know their neighbors, this sort of thing, so it isn't really that realistic.
So what does this mean for your clients then?
Well,
Mrs. Bartlett has told me that, you know, it's now a question of survival, quite literally. She's going to have to stay in bed all day, 2 days a week.
I really can't discuss it from the basis of that particular situation, but certainly long-term care's intent is not to create hardship at all. And if a client can't get their shopping done by any other means, then we'll end up doing the shopping. And in some instances where cuts have been made, the assessors have had to go back and reinstate the hours. But they're pushing, they're trying to get this to happen and get clients maybe to, for instance, order their groceries. Well, even that creates a bit of a problem for a client.
You know, the president of your association has called this a bit of a cruel game. Would you go along with that?
I would like to think that these people really need the help. And I know that the health costs have escalated, but I'd like to see them controlled in other ways besides pulling away service like this, which is such a basic service. And the whole intent of the program is to maintain people in their home. And that means you have to look after them physically, and they have to have good mental well-being. And if they're anxious about what's happening to them and what's in the future, and are they not going to be able to get their homemaker, then that's going to pull their health down. And I think in the long run, it could create hardships on people. They're just not going to be able to function as well at home.
This is the Office of Access 81. It's a new collective voice for the disabled and disabled agencies around the province, where they have been collecting dozens of letters from homemaker agencies around BC protesting this freeze on the home care program. And Pat McRae is the one who's been reading them all. Pat, what have they been telling you?
They've been telling us about the drastic cut in hours. Hickson has been cut 273 hours. Langley has been cut a number of hours. They've had to lay off 35 homemakers out there. And this is all, even though, how I say this, even though they're doing this cutting, Mr. Nielsen says there is no cut.
But is it a cut in your view?
Yes, it is.
Now, how badly will it affect the people in the province, disabled?
The elderly disabled, it's going to affect a lot. The maximum hours that a person can get is 120. Now, if you're severely disabled, 120 hours goes nowhere.
But the minister says, well, you know, let's be realistic. The money isn't there. Get friends and relatives to come in and pick up the slack.
Well, what do you do if your relatives or friends don't live here? They live in other provinces or other countries, and your friends are older, and they can't do these things for you. Or your kids live in other places, and they're working. They have families of their own. They can't do it.
How would you characterize the freeze, or cutback, or whatever you want to call it?
It's the pits. The real pits. I think some of the cuts that they have done to severely disabled people are criminal. And I have been cut myself, just about 8 hours a month. I'd like to see Mr. Nielsen get by on vacuuming his house every 2 weeks, or washing his clothes every 2 weeks, or cleaning his bathroom once a month.
What response have you had from the government?
Nothing. We can't get Mr. Nielsen's office at all. We've tried for about 10 days steady, about 2 weeks ago, to get him, and there was no reply.
What do you need? What do the disabled need?
They need no cutback. They seem to think that the answer is to probably put them back in long-term care institutions, extended care. And that's going to cost the government a hell of a lot more than it does right now. The homemakers are only getting about $7 an hour, maximum, but they're paying $10 to the agencies. Now, it's a lot cheaper to pay $45 a day to an agency than it is to pay $200 a day for a bed in a hospital.
Can the agencies you've heard from around the province, are they satisfied that they can survive with this cutback or freeze?
Some of them, not all of them. Most of them are complaining about the cut. I'm not saying that all the cuts are not justified, because some of them are, but the majority of them aren't.
Is it a question of priorities?
Well, it doesn't seem to be, but I hopefully that it would be priorities, and I think priorities are for people to stay in their own home and not be put in an institution. We have some friends, a lady that's been cut 50 hours, who has to stay in bed every other day. What kind of a life is that? And I heard of another young fellow who only gets 120. He's just existing. He just breathes. That's all he does. He can't go anywhere. Yet this is 1981, the International Year of Disabled Persons. And so far, all they've done is cut us, refuse to listen to us, refuse to make changes that are acceptable to us. We are people. We know what we want. We don't need somebody telling us.
This is the International Year of the Disabled. And I had a phone call yesterday saying you haven't done very much about the International Year of the Disabled. But I plead not guilty. Over the years, I've been involved in the founding of many organizations dealing with disabled of different kinds. It's such a tough subject to deal with. Even Steve was quite cruel this morning. Steve said to Emerald, wouldn't you be better in an institution? But it brings home to the point that she would not be better in an institution. Might be easier and more convenient and cheaper for us, but no, she wouldn't be better off. I'll be back to the International Year of the Disabled on another occasion. Next, though, we're going to get greedy. We're going to ask you to put up, this is a joke, a couple of $1,000 and you can buy $50,000 worth of gold, with Peter Cavelti on how to invest in gold after the break. Oh, you're listening this morning. Good. Thank you.
And then 6 minutes again?
5 minutes after it.
All right.
You think I'm stupid? Oh, how much am I getting at the end this morning?
How long is he gonna? He's gonna get 30.
Full 30. Peter Cavelti describes himself as an international banker. He's written a book, How to Invest in Gold. Are you seriously suggesting to me, Peter Cavelti, from Montreal and Toronto, that I should give a broker $2,500, which will buy me $46,000 worth of gold?
No, that's not what I'm recommending at all. In fact, the precipitous decline in the gold price from $850 just a little while ago to the $460 now illustrates that that's perhaps a very bad idea. It's a risky market. And maybe I should say at the beginning, I'm not a gold guru. There are gold gurus. I'm not one of them.
You're not a Harry Brown?
No, no. I'm an international banker. Gold is my specialty, but there are times when the circumstances are right that I find gold a viable investment. And of course, there are many ways of investing in gold, from bullions to wafers to coins to futures, jewelry, and so on. And my specialty is really what is the right investment at which time.
I want to make the beady little eyes of the crew around here glitter. And you tell me how much one would have made if one had bought 1 ounce of gold when it was pegged in Canada, what year that was, and how much they could have made on that 1 ounce of gold at the top of the market.
Mm-hmm. Well, gold was dealing at about 10 years ago at $35 an ounce, and if somebody had liquidated their gold holdings in January of 1980, when it reached a high of $850, they could have made roughly $815 an ounce, or thousands of percent, basically about 2,000% over the decade. Now, that actually illustrates gold's only way in which one should approach it, namely as a long-term investment which one holds over a period of time, not as a short-term vehicle to make a quick dollar.
Let me get that quite clear. You're telling me with the utmost confidence that if someone with the appropriate money buys gold today, for cash, it's not margined, it's not borrowed money, that it's 1,000% certain that 20 years from now, the gold will make them money?
Well, I'd like to give you a straight answer and say yes, but let me put it this way. I have charted the various economies of the world and price developments, and since data, from the point from which data exist to today, the gold price has, in each free market economy, stayed ahead of the development of inflation. So if we assume that this is going to continue as a parallel, then you're right.
It might not continue. Canada savings bonds for the next year are at 19.5%, which surely indicates that the government gurus consider that the inflation or interest rates throughout next year will be no less than 19.5%. Is that not correct?
Well, I would agree with that notion, and in fact that is what has had that negative influence on gold just recently. We're dealing with a situation now which is very unusual, has maybe happened 3 or 4 times in history only, namely where the return on short-term money on a guaranteed basis is many percent higher than the rate of inflation. And that, of course, discourages any investment. Gold is one, stocks are another, bonds are another, real estate is another. And all these investments will continue to decline as long as that spread, that premium of short-term deposit rates over inflation continues. Now, there are 2 scenarios which can develop from this. One is a deflationary scenario, and one is a bailing out by government of this economy, which would result in more inflation. And of course, gold would react in different patterns according to which one is chosen.
You're telling me if inflation continues at this horrendous rate as of this moment, and the money supply is concentrated on short-term deposits with institutions, that the price of gold will go down?
Yes, provided this. Well, inflation, you call it a horrendous rate, but you see the lead economy is the U.S. economy. In the U.S. economy, the inflation rate has come down very heavily. It's currently at about 9% per annum, and just a little while ago it was close to 20% per annum.
But what you're telling me, therefore, that Canada's influence on that, its separate and individualistic inflation rate, for whatever that's worth, won't necessarily affect the international price?
Absolutely. It has no bearing on it at all. Now, that means that gold can, against the Canadian dollar, react differently than against the US dollar because, of course, when Canada's inflation rate is high and that of the United States is low, the Canadian dollar will drop against the US dollar.
Fascinating. More with Peter Cavelti. Are you related to Tony?
Yes, very distantly, but I am.
42nd cousins.
That's right.
After the break. What good is gold? Said he to Peter Cavelti, who's going to telling you how to invest in gold. What good is gold? You don't get interest in your gold, do you?
No, that's the biggest disadvantage.
Do you get possession of your gold?
You can take possession. There are various ways of doing it. You can buy gold and take it home and store it under your mattress if you want to take the risk.
Only the French do that. What a nightmare.
Well, it's a nightmare to some. Some people, however, believe that that is the only way of doing it, and that is usually not so in Canada, but there are some people, some areas in the world where that makes sense at certain times. Think of the tens of thousands of Southeast Asian refugees who came here with nothing but gold. Well, to them it made good sense because it was the only thing available in which they could wrap up a significant amount of wealth in something the size of a chocolate bar.
Or in your teeth.
Yes, and hope to negotiate it tomorrow morning. Now that's a bit more difficult with the gold in your teeth, but with a little wafer you can. And that's important. These people could have gone to Hong Kong, to Zurich, to Toronto, to New York, to Frankfurt, and negotiated that against cash the next morning. Now, you can't say that of any stock, bond, currency, of nothing really.
So really it's a nervous person's security, it's a frightened person's security, it's a refugee's security.
Absolutely, in that sense. Now, when you talk as gold as an investment, of course, it's something else than just a hedge for a refugee or a hedge against political uncertainty.
Back to that, briefly, to that business of putting down a small amount of money and buying a lot of gold. Is that a very specialized and dangerous trick, is it not?
Well,
is that what you call gold futures?
Yes, that's margined, leveraged gold investments, and I find that by far the most risky way of doing it. The least risky way of doing it is just the other, to highlight the other extreme, is of course a little purchase of bullion, a 1 ounce wafer or a Krugerrand or something, which basically has the advantage of very low transaction charges, instant negotiability, and you know the limits to your risk.
Gold coins, are they not rather dicey unless it is a Krugerrand, a properly certified Krugerrand, which contains what percentage of gold?
Or a Krugerrand of 1 ounce, they come in various denominations, contains 1 ounce of fine gold. In other words, if you melt, it weighs slightly over an ounce, the fineness is slightly less than 1,000, and therefore it works out exactly to 1 ounce.
Have many people done it in Canada?
Krugerrand purchases?
No, gold purchases.
Gold purchases,
Little
yes.
people, I mean, ordinary people.
I think the percentage of people participating in the gold market from the public is still very small. However, the company I work for, we feel that it's increasing by a percentage of about 15% per year.
But if you bought futures or even bought gold when it was up in the $500, $600, $700, $800 level, you'd be left holding a very big bag.
Well, that's right. That illustrates a very important point. Again, gold is not an investment that you should initiate for a short period. Gold, you know, let me throw this back at you. If you had bought it 5 years ago, exactly the same month and the same date, 5 years ago in 1976, and you were to sell it now, then you'd make 400% profit.
Before my time, I remembered when some of the European countries, particularly Britain, went off what they called the gold standard. Are all the countries now on a gold standard of its value is likely to lump it? Because their currency isn't backed by gold, is it?
That's right.
It's not backed by gold.
No currency is any longer backed by gold in the entire world.
They're only backed by printing presses.
By printing presses, and therefore gold presents an economic counter-extreme to paper money.
Funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just a piece of metal.
It's a piece of metal, but it's a very extraordinary piece of metal. It has a variety of industrial applications. It's very rare. I'm sure you've seen that comparison where all the gold that's been mined since mankind started out could be contained in a cube of about 40 yards in each dimension, and that in itself presents or provides a degree of protection.
So because of its malleability, its decorative purposes, it's valuable.
It's valuable, yes.
Those are the only reasons. Scarcity, malleability,
portability, liquidity,
low
transaction costs. You're talking about a 1 ounce wafer. If I buy today, I sell it tomorrow, 1.5% to 2% transaction charge. Again, you're better off than with a stock or a bond. But one should only put very little of one's overall assets into gold. It's only a hedge.
Peter Cavelti, how to invest in gold. Have you made a fortune in it?
In gold? Not a fortune, no.
Good bit of money.
I have made money in gold, yes.
My thanks to Peter Cavelti. Fascinating little session. After the break.
Thank you.